we go back to the same presentation, inshallah, but continuing it. So I decided for today, inshallah, for the next at least few minutes, we go over a few points that we discussed before for the benefit of those who missed the first half hour last Friday. So first we start with Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase us in knowledge and to make our knowledge useful in this life and the hereafter, inshallah. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to open our hearts so we can learn and so that we can benefit and so that we can transfer this knowledge in the best way possible to future generations. So I'm going to go through a little bit of a summary, as I said, of what we covered last time. So last time we talked about first the definition of shirk, correct? And we gave it a broad definition. So I'm going to start with this a little bit to recap. So why are we talking about these issues as shirk? So the question that came up a lot last time and even after was that, if we are falling into what we call behavioral dysregulation, is this really considered shirk? In other words, if you're not aware of it, is this shirk? And I thought a lot about this, and in my opinion, it is a doorway to shirk. Let me put it this way. It is, we called it pathways, right? Pathways to behavioral dysregulation. So let me give you this quick example so we can set the stage and really have a good handle on it. So if we say that somebody is giving you a little bit of a drug every single day without your being aware of it, okay? And that little bit of a drug causes you to behave in ways that are dysregulated. That makes sense now, right? This is what we're talking about. What would be your responsibility and your culpability? Mas'uliyah, your responsibility in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you don't know about it, that's one thing. If you do know that somebody is doing that to you, now what? Fair enough? This is the situation we find ourselves in. Are we sure that we are left alone to behave exactly in a natural way according to the fitrah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created? The answer is no. We're not sure. As a matter of fact, we're sure of the opposite. We're not left to behave according to fitrah. So therefore, we know something is wrong. Fair enough? So starting from this this fact, we know that our behavior is being dysregulated. Remember the word "this" on purpose for the causing of harm. Remember? Misinformation versus disinformation. So dysregulation is somebody doing it on purpose to cause harm of some sort, to cause you to behave in ways that are not according to fitrah. Now, we know this for a fact. Our responsibility in front of Allah is what? To be aware of what's happening and to start investigating how our behavior is being dysregulated to push us away from the path of fitrah. So therefore, learning about these things is an obligation. It's no longer an excuse, and I assure you, at least 95% of human beings know that their behavior is being dysregulated. At least 95%. Is anybody aware that they're not being subjected to advertising that affects their behavior? Of course not. All people are aware of this. Is anybody not aware that how they were brought up affects how they think and how they teach others to behave? Of course they are aware of this. Are we not aware that if I had an incident in my history, in my personal history, that's going to affect how I behave with others in the future? Of course we know this. If you really think about it for just a little bit, you become totally aware of it. Therefore, once we know that our behavior is dysregulated, it becomes mandatory and obligatory and part of our responsibility to discover all the ways, all the pathways that we should be aware of and try to correct. Once you're aware that something is happening, if you don't do anything about it, you cannot claim that I'm no longer aware. So therefore it becomes shirk. To disregard it becomes shirk. Make sense? So in other words, if I go back to the example, if somebody is giving you a little bit of a drug every single day, you're not aware of it, and you behave in a certain way desirable to the person who gave you the drug. You're not aware of it. And then you become aware of it. At that moment, it's no longer innocent. At that moment, if you let it happen to you, you are culpable and responsible. I think we need the power, so it doesn't shut down automatically. Fair enough? So that's why we're doing this. So yes, not all of these things are obvious shirk, but all of them, after we are aware of them, become our responsibility to avoid shirk. Fair enough, right? So that's the clear definition that we're operating within. So I will summarize, as I said, part 1, which is the first 2 to 3 hours that we covered last Friday. Here, I'll do it. Thank you. Before I dive into the summary, I want to go back again over our definition of monotheism. And we assigned it a name. I like that name a lot because it was coined by a very famous American scholar called John Esposito. John Esposito, professor at Georgetown University, very famous, has dozens of books, is a very fair person. He himself is not a Muslim. I asked him specifically, and he let me hear it. He says, it's none of your business, basically. That's what he said. You shouldn't be asking that type of question. But in fairness, he has been one of the most eloquent defender of the values and the sources of Islam. He defines Islam as radical monotheism. And we said the word radical does not mean extremist. Radical, or the synonym of extremism, has been imposed on the word radical. The original word radical means to the root of monotheism. In other words, this tree of monotheism exemplifies itself in everything in your behavior, and it's rooted deep in your soul, that you believe in it, and you act on it, and you think according to it, and you live in full submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's a definition of radical. So radical from root, not radical from extremism. So in order to achieve Islam as radical monotheism, we need to really focus on every aspect that could affect our fitrah, our pristine nature with which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has endowed us. So the ultimate question that we asked last time is, do we have really free will or not? The question is, how much of the pristine fitrah do we still have? Make sense now? So if your pristine fitrah is still intact, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guarantees out of His fairness that you have free will. But if your fitrah is being massaged and manipulated to cause you to misbehave in unacceptable way, then you're no longer in possession of a pristine fitrah that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. Make sense? Therefore, so to go back to radical monotheism, we have to seek this fitrah to cleanse as much of the poisonous manipulation that we have been subjected to. And I don't mean poisonous only biologically, but poisonous in terms of our thoughts and psychology and our subjective indoctrination, collective socialization, all of these things. Very good. So I need to say one more thing again before I dive into the quick summary of what we covered last time. Why is this so important? Why am I fighting so hard? And Brother Mahmoud knows that I really pushed hard to make this science, this knowledge, accessible to everybody. And he was very gracious and generous to give me the opportunity to speak to you on Friday and today. The reason is I totally believe this falls under something called muharabat al-shubuhat in Arabic. What is muharabat al-shubuhat? Shubuhat are accusations that the opponents of Islam throw to derail Muslims from their religion. This is what the definition of shubuha, right? So they tell you, oh, your religion is a violent religion. This is a shubha, right? It's a suspicious accusation that causes you to doubt the authenticity of this deen. Now, are we talking about shubuhat of the nature that would cause you to leave your religion? Probably not. But for a lot of our youth, including my own kids, my own children, they are subjected to these things every single day. So when you have a professor out of Stanford called Robert Sapolsky, who writes books and gives lectures to try to convince us that we are really not free creatures, that we are really a lot closer to baboons, which he studied for 30 plus years. He says their behavior is very much like the behavior of a human being, and the behavior of a human being is very much like the behavior of animals. We behave automatically, we're almost programmatically set up to do what we're told, or what our biology says, or what indoctrination says, and so on. Now, if you're a youth who's not very versed in the philosophy of the Quran regarding these matters, you become suspicious. Is there really a God if we are just like animals? Are we supposed to be held to account? And the answer that will come to their mind with the help of shaitan is no. And therefore everything is acceptable. So it's very vicious impregnation of the youth, of the minds of the youth, with these types of shubuhat, these types of suspicions that need to be fought, that need to be addressed. So for our youth, emotional attachment, which a lot of the immigrant Muslims bring with them, right? So, if you came from a family that's very traditionally Muslim, or from a Muslim society, or you grew up for generations with Islam as the norm for you, you develop an emotional attachment to it. Yes? With our youth, that's not their context. Even if your family is very devout, even if you try to do your best, the influence of society at large upon the youth is a lot more overpowering. And therefore, this emotional identity-based attachment does not safeguard their faith, does not protect them from falling into these shubuhat. So we have to think a lot more aggressively, I should say, or a lot more insightfully about how to reach the minds of our youth using the logic and the reasoning from within this society. So in other words, وَدَاوِنِي بِالَّتِي كَانَتْ هِيَ الدَّاءُ. We treat these accusations with reasoning and with science from inside this context, from this society. And that's why I've said many times, and I'll repeat it again, and I hope you take this message to heart. You bring a sheikh who was raised in a Muslim country somewhere, and I'm gonna, say either an Arab country or Pakistan or a village in Indonesia or whatever, and you put him in this country to preach Islam, it doesn't work, because he is bringing a mentality that is absolutely different than the mentality of our youth, even our own mentality. By the way, I was talking to a very dear friend of mine who is also a very highly educated Muslim scholar, and he, used to be very well positioned academic scholar in various Islamic universities. And he told me something that very few of us know. As part of the, when they used to, in our history, they used to prepare du'at, inviters, right? Du'at. These are preachers who are sent to foreign lands on purpose to bring Islam to the non-Muslims. One of the tests they had for these preachers is how many countries and how many different societies they have been to before taking on the responsibility of da'wah. And if the answer is none, you're not qualified to go do da'wah to non-Muslims. In other words, you have to practice living in different types of societies and being exposed to this flexibility of living with the mentality of different people in order to bring Islam to them in their mentality, not in the mentality with which you were brought up. This was part of our tradition. A lot of us in the United States, unfortunately, sometimes we're not aware of these things, and we allow. And to be honest with you, I've been to some sermons and lectures where it was downright embarrassing to hear what the sheikh was saying, because it just did not fit. There was one time I was sitting with my two boys in a Friday prayer, and I was so tempted to leave in the middle of that Friday sermon because it was just unacceptable what he was saying. As soon as we got out, I apologized to my boys. I said, I really apologize that I took your time to cause you to hear this nonsense that was being said. So it is your responsibility as the recipients of these concepts and these ideas to reject them and to refuse anyone who is still practicing these wrong concepts. So what am I saying? I'm saying is that if we don't understand the venues, the pathways of shirk that we are subjected to in this country, which is what we're talking about here and what we talked about last Friday, if we're not aware of them, we have no right to talk about Islam and to do da'wah. Because we're doing da'wah against who? There's shaitan, right? Shaitan is our opponent. I'm trying to invite a friend of mine or a non-Muslim or even our own youth. Who is the enemy? Who is the one who doesn't want this to happen? Shaitan, right? Inna shaitana lakum aduun fattakhiduhu aduwan. He is the enemy, not the person I'm inviting. I'm inviting him out of mercy. I'm inviting him out of goodwill toward him. Fine. So the shaitan is working against my effort. What does the shaitan use? The shaitan uses the mind of the person I'm trying to invite to deceive or to deflate and cause my efforts to fail. Make sense? So in other words, it is absolutely impossible to do da'wah without understanding all the different ways that shaitan has been manipulating our target audience. Let me repeat it again. It is impossible and should be prohibited for us to do da'wah unless we understand how shaitan is manipulating our target audience. This is the necessity of this ilm. This is the importance that this science, this knowledge, be shared and promoted and people are trained in it. I hope this passionate plea reached you. So we talked about the futility of relying within our families on emotional attachment to Islam. That's not enough. You need to speak to them this language. And you need to speak to the society at large using this language. Okay. So there is a possibility, as I go through all of these scientific evidence or this scientific evidence that I shared with you last Friday and I will continue today, that you start thinking that Dr. Hany is a victim of scientism. You know what scientism is? What is scientism? Okay, so when we say racism, what does that mean? The ism is what? It's bias based on that system that we're describing, right? So a racist person, his highest value that he adheres to, he follows day and night, is his race. Yes? It's obedience and protecting his own race. That's racism, correct? Scientism is a person who falls into a situation where his highest value, his highest priority is to bow down to the results of science. That's scientism. It's a form of shirk. Yes? Dr. Hany is not that. I learn, I'm a trained scientist, very well trained scientist, but I don't submit blindly to science. We select from science that which makes sense and which is proven, which can be authoritatively shown to be the truth, to be aligned with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but that's not where we stop. That's only where we begin. The ultimate reference to us is what? Is wahi. Is revelation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I'm going to give you one quick example. The Quran uses the example of 3 different insects in the Quran. This is all bonus, by the way, waiting for other people to arrive. So you're getting a lot of stuff that other people who arrive late are not going to hear. So the Quran gives us the example of 3 insects. Anybody knows what these insects are? One, raise your hand. A fly. Ba'uda, which is what? Mosquito. What else? I will hold on to that one because it's not, first it's not an insect, second it's a question mark whether or not the Quran talks about alaqa as we understand it, yes? No, I'm talking about insects. We talked about, so you said which one? Al-dhubab, al-ba'uda, al-ankabut, there's one more, 4. Yes? Al-nahl. Al-nahl, 4, right? Yes, mashallah. And Naml, that's another one, 5. But I want to focus on 3. So as far as this discussion, we need to focus on 3. First one is the fly. The fly, as you know, likes garbage and hovers around garbage and feeds on garbage and grows and thrives on garbage. The bee is a very productive insect, very disciplined insect, and it's the insect that Allah has described as having given that insect wahi, revelation to. وَأَوْحَى رَبُّكَ إِلَى النَّحْلِ أَنِ اتَّخِذِي مِنَ الْجِبَالِ بُيُوتًا. Allah, your Lord, has revealed to the insect that's a bee, to the bees, that you should make out of mountains your houses or your shelters. And because of this revelation, now we don't have agriculture without bees. Very useful insect. How many farmers depend on flies to run their agriculture business? No, flies. Nobody. It's the opposite. They result from what eats the bodies. In other words, they result from the larvae that eats actually, right? So they are garbage cleaners. Yes, of course there is benefit in that because Allah did not create anything without any benefit. But I'm talking about real, everyday benefit that helps us live correctly. I'm not talking about the benefit of getting rid of the trash. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave revelation to the bees and they become very useful insects. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the spider and he says, وَإِنَّ أَوْهَنَ الْبُيُوتِ لَبَيْتُ الْعَنْكَبُوتِ. It's the weakest house. That's the house of the spider. And I'm not going to go through all the details, but scientism is that house, in my opinion. Scientism, those who depend on science and hang on to science to deny Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to deny revelation, to deny prophethood, to deny the books of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are literally living in a house as weak as the house of a spider. So I'm just making sure you understand my background. I am a very good and well-trained scientist, but I don't submit to science blindly. I refer always to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has taught us and try to decipher and to understand as much as possible the words of the Quran, so we can bring the two together when that's possible. And when there's a conflict, I go back to the wahy, to the revelation. That's my primary guideline. And this question, by the way, is called epistemology in philosophy. And I apologize, I'm throwing a lot of big words on you or at you, but I really want you to understand these concepts. They're part of being a Muslim. You can't be a Muslim in this day and age without understanding these concepts. So what's epistemology? Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that says, how do I know what I know? Very simple question. How do I know what I know? How do I know that what I have in my head is actual knowledge? And there are two huge, highly respected scholars, one Muslim and one non-Muslim, who addressed this question to sort of unleash this science. So epistemology, right? Epistemology is the science of detecting whether or not my knowledge is accurate. So the first one is Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, who died in 1111 AD, right? 1111. It's very easy to remember. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, in his book Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, Deliverance from Error, and it's been translated by two different people. One of them is Montgomery Watt, and another one, I forgot his name right now. And he asked the same question: how do I know what I know? And his answer was, I went through a process. And the process, those of you who are familiar with Descartes, listen to this one. Because Abu Hamid al-Ghazali came before, you know who Descartes is? Have you heard of that name? Okay. MashaAllah, the sisters are always raising their hand on these tough questions. Descartes came much later, in the 15th century, and he asked the same question. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali came before him about 400 or 500 years. Abu Hamid al-Ghazali asked, how do I know the truth? How do I recognize the truth? And he answered by saying, I went through a process. He says, I thought, okay, we depend on our senses. My sense of feeling, my sense of touch, my sense of taste, my sense of hearing, my sense of seeing, correct? And then he thought, but sometimes I look at two stars and I see they're the same shape, same size, but I know with my head that that's not true. Therefore, my senses deceive me. And he also gave the example of the mirage, right? At the end of a very long plateau in the middle of the desert, you see water, right? But after you try to discover, that's not true. So he says, no, senses cannot be it. Then he thought, okay, maybe it is my mind, my reasoning. And then he thought, well, while I am in a dream state, I'm dreaming, I see things very vividly in my brain, in my mind. My mind show me things. And when I wake up, I know that those things were not real. So my mind is able to impress on me or to imply or to suggest certain things that turn out to be wrong. So the mind is not the tool that we use to detect what's right and what's wrong. And he fell back on revelation. Yes? So he says revelation is the ultimate source for us. The question is, how do you understand what's in the revelation? That's where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave you the reasoning and the mind to work your way through this. Right? The second person, Descartes, asked that same question and came up with the conclusion, I think, therefore I am. You all heard of this. Right? I think, therefore I am. His final conclusion is The only thing I know is that I exist. And the reason I know I exist is because I'm thinking about my existence. And he built his whole cosmology, his whole worldview, his whole basis of knowing what's right and what's wrong based on that one single fact. But he was relying on what? On reasoning 100%. Okay? So two different scholars reached two different conclusions. Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Ghazali, rahimahullah, was a very brilliant scholar, and he did not only rely on reasoning. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us the same thing, that if you depend only on your mind and your reasoning, you will reach hawa. The key word is only. Yes? So there are ways. So recognize it's a very useful tool, but it's got limitations. So if I tell you I have a plot of land, as an example, right? I have a plot of land and I want you to measure it for me, and I'll give you $200 for doing this measurement. And by the way, all I'm going to give you is a 12-inch ruler. That's my tool. My tool, right? Is this tool adequate for measuring this plot of land? It may give me an approximation, but it's very faulty. The process itself is very faulty. So I measure the first 12 inches, I have to carry it to another 12 inches, and so on. And somewhere down the middle, I forget whether it's 78 times or 79 times I've done this. So the mind, as a tool for reasoning, is very good, but it's not perfect, and we can't rely on it 100%. So far, so good? And the Quran tells us this. By the way, when the Quran wants to encourage us, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لَعَلَّكُمْ تَعْقِلُونَ. Perchance you reflect and you think. So definitely recommended. Definitely recommended that you use it. But other times when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants to put down people, to sort of say something derisive against them, He says, صم بكم عمي لا يعقلون فهم لا يعقلون. They're deaf, they're mute, they're blind, and they can't even think. فهم لا يعقلون. So there is a minimum of reasoning and using the mind that's absolutely required. But it's not the ceiling. Please be careful. Okay? So scientism is not Islam. Science is part of acquiring knowledge, but it's not our ceiling. It's a tool on the way. It's perhaps the beginning to make observations, to think, to reflect. Did you have a question? Okay, No. Okay, so the question is about ilm, and I'm saying ilm is something that Allah gives us. Notice what I said, gives us. Present tense. Please pay attention to what I'm using. Not gave us. Okay. ولا يحيطون بشيء من علمه إلا بما شاء. Right? هذا الكرسي. Right? ولا يحيط. Wait. Just slow down. I'm just giving you examples so we can put things in perspective. So ilm is given in the present tense. Yes? So for example, a human being who is raised in the forest and never sees any other human being, he acquires some knowledge, but he's limited. Yes? We acquire a lot more knowledge by interactions. So ilm is not something that happened in the past. It's a continuous process, and the source of this ilm, I'm bringing back the question you asked to my point of epistemology. Ilm is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the present tense. وَلَا يُحِيطُونَ is فعل مضارع. فعل مضارع meaning now. Anybody who acquires ilm, knowledge, acquires it by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then the second part is علمه. حرف الهاء الضمير الغائب refers back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So any ilm we acquire comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala taught Adam, allama, in the past, asma. And there's a lot of disagreement on what that word asma refers to. Wait, I don't want to go into it right now because we really need to come back to this. But I want to focus on ilm because we're talking about epistemology. We're talking about our sources of information. How do I know what I know is right? And I'm not saying I do. I'm just asking the question. This is a branch of philosophy that we all should be aware of, right? So if somebody comes to you and say, the meaning of this ayah is this. First question should come to your mind is, how does this person know? How does this person know? Right? Because the Quran tells us to, إن جاءكم فاسق بنبأ فتبينوا. Always seek the evidence. Correct? In other words, what's Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaching us? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is teaching us, don't rent your brain to somebody else. Don't allow your brain to be free space for others to dump their ideas into it. Remember we talked about misinformation and disinformation? That's exactly what they're trying to do. واضح؟ طيب. We need to continue. تسمحي لي كمل؟ إن شاء الله. So we talked about epistemology, we talked about the importance of not relying on science 100%, but using it as a useful tool and recognizing its boundaries. So let's go through the brief summary of what we covered. Do we have any questions so far? المنقذ من الضلال. One more comment, also in the aspect of going over some of the things we went through last time. Shirk is defined in Arabic as what? In Arabic, how give me a sentence that defines what shirk. In Arabic, first we take the Arabic version. I apologize. إشراك غير الله في العبادة. Do you agree with this one? Okay. So the word عبادة means what? What does that mean? Worship, that means I sit down and bow to it, or worship in another meaning? Ta'a. Very good. Excellent. This is an essential point of understanding ibadah. So we worship Allah, that means we obey Allah. That's what it means. As a matter of fact, the word abada comes from someone, the proper definition of the word abd. Abd is a wayfarer. Wayfarer. Somebody who walks along a way, along a path. A journey person. Who is on a journey. That's the abd. Right? So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ. He's not talking about servants. Of course, we need to submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But is He addressing only those who obey Allah? In that verse, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَى أَنفُسِهِمْ. Is He addressing only Muslims and only believers? No, He's addressing all mankind, right? Ya ibadi. Are ibadi only the Muslims? No. Ibadur Rahman are described in a different place. الذين يمشون على الأرض هونا وإذا خاطبهم الجاهلون قالوا سلاما, etc. as defined for the Muslim ibad. But the word ibad, everybody. All human beings. Yes? So, the abd is from عبد الطريق. When we say عبد الطريق, that means he made the road flat and ready to be used for pedestrians and for vehicles. Made it flat, made it usable. Abada is to go over that road. عبد الطريق. Yes? That means he followed. So in the context of ibadatullah, worshipping Allah, that means obedience to Allah. Makes sense, right? So to obey willingly or unwillingly, commands or inspirations or dysregulated behavior implications from others is in violation of ibadatullah. That's a form of shirk. That's why we're talking about this as shirk. So now we've covered a lot of the concepts that are really important to make sure we understand why this knowledge is part of avoiding shirk. So far so good? Any questions about what I said? Okay, so last time we talked about the different path, in plural, or pathways to behavioral dysregulation. I want to make sure you really get this concept, behavioral dysregulation. Anybody has a question? Please, if you have any doubt whether or not you understand what it means, tell me so we can describe it in more details. So, just to summarize, I say this machine is well regulated, right? Let's say I talk about my car. The steering wheel is regulated. What does that mean? It's balanced and adjusted correctly and works exactly as it should work. When I say it's dysregulated, I don't have full control over it. Makes sense, right? That's what we're talking about. So your behavior is not fully within your masterful, willful control. Yes, but I want to define it more. I'm trying to give it a little bit more meat, a little more, make it a little less abstract. So what you said is correct. Abide by the laws, but it's not just obedience to laws. It's about being aware of whether or not you're behaving correctly. You see. I'm sure it happened to all of us. We have friends or relatives who come to you and say, I don't feel right. I'm doing things that are, I don't usually do. I'm getting hungry for things that I don't usually eat that much. Or I like to walk and now I find myself, I don't have the energy. Dysregulation. Something unusual is happening. That's dysregulation. If you're aware of it, or if you're not aware of it, that's dysregulation. So we said we're going to cover 12 in total, or at least, the science has identified so far at least 12 categories of behavioral dysregulation. We need to stop for Asr, correct? Okay. So before I get into this, let's stop for Asr, inshallah. And then when we finish the Asr, we'll continue, inshallah.